Temp trash. That's what someone had written across her name tag in permanent marker. Rachel Torres didn't flinch when she saw it taped to her locker at 6:15 a.m. She just peeled it off, dropped it in the trash can beside the lockers, and walked toward the emergency department like the words meant nothing. They didn't. She'd survived worse than a coward's marker. She'd survived Marjah. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she moved through the hallway of Oak Creek Memorial, that antiseptic smell sharp in her nostrils, bleach and something chemical that was supposed to mean clean but mostly meant institutional. San Antonio's October heat had already made the morning feel thick through the windows. Her scrubs were navy blue, the kind that came from the hospital supply closet, nothing that marked her as anything other than temp staff. Her badge clipped to her pocket read, R. Torres, temporary nursing personnel. No title. No credentials displayed. That was how she'd engineered it. 63 days. That's how long she'd been at Oak Creek Memorial. Long enough to learn the layout, long enough to understand the hierarchy, not long enough for anyone to ask questions about her past. Long enough, but not long enough. She perfected the art of invisibility in 12 years of running classified combat medicine operations in special forces. Another life. Another name. Another Rachel. She pushed through the double doors into the emergency department at 6:22 a.m. The ER was quiet, that pre-dawn calm before the city woke up and started breaking itself. 2 nurses at the central station, both looking at screens. A resident drinking coffee. The smell of stale coffee and the hiss of the ventilation system. The monitor in Bay 3 beeped its steady rhythm. Normal. Safe. Invisible. Rachel moved to the supply station and pulled out her equipment cart for the morning. She worked with the kind of methodical precision that would have gotten her noticed in any other profession. In the ER, precision was expected. Precision was invisible. She checked the 4 kits, the saline bags, the catheters, checking twice because she'd learned that hospitals killed people through carelessness, not accidents. The same way wars did. Her fingers found the pocket of her scrubs, the one where she kept the trauma shears. The ones with the engraved callsign on the handle. She didn't need to look at it. Her thumb traced the letters, worn smooth from years of hands that had saved lives in fields where there weren't any hospitals. The callsign was from another world. A world she was supposed to have erased. The training never left your hands. That was what they didn't tell you when they buried your records and ordered you to disappear. The muscle memory stayed. The instinct stayed. The precision stayed. You could put on civilian scrubs and work in a hospital where nobody knew your name, but your hand still remembered how to save people under fire. Still remembered how to do it fast. Torres. One of the nurses at the station didn't look up. Her name was Ellen. Ellen had been at Oak Creek for 9 years. She was kind. We've got an incoming from the Army base. Training accident. ETA for minutes. Rachel nodded. What's the patient profile? Male, early 30s. Airway compromise from blunt force trauma. They're calling it severe. Ellen glanced up now, just barely. Dr. Hargrove's in surgery. It'll probably be you and Dr. Chen until someone else gets here. Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. Not anything as simple as that. Readiness. The kind that came from knowing what you could do when the noise stopped and the pressure started. She was at Bay 1 by 6:31 a.m., checking the equipment. Laryngoscope. Endotracheal tubes in 4 sizes. Suction. The crash cart positioned 3 feet away. Her movements were clean, economical, the kind of preparation that looked routine to anyone watching. It wasn't routine. It was muscle memory from a place that didn't exist on any official map. The ambulance bay doors opened at 6:34 a.m., and the paramedics came through with controlled urgency. The sergeant was conscious but struggling, his breathing already labored, blood in his mouth and nose from a training accident, something with a metal bar during equipment setup. His airway was closing. She could see it in the way his neck muscles were tensing, in the sound of his breathing. The hiss of air trying to find a path through swelling tissue. Trauma Bay 1, Rachel said, her voice level. We need to move. The paramedics knew efficiency when they saw it. They transferred him without the usual medical school theater. Rachel was already moving, already reading the vitals coming off the monitor. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 78%. 73%. He had minutes, maybe less. I'm going to need to secure his airway now, Rachel said to Dr. Chen, who had just arrived, still tying her hair back. We should wait for. We don't have time to wait. Rachel's voice didn't change pitch. It just carried absolute certainty. SATs are 71 and dropping. Airways closing. I'm doing a cricothyrotomy. Dr. Chen stepped back. She'd been at Oak Creek for 3 years and recognized the thing that couldn't be argued with, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The thing that made the air pressure change. The presence like a hawk settling on a branch, completely still, completely lethal, completely certain. Rachel pulled out the trauma shears from her pocket. The ones with the call sign. The ones nobody was supposed to know about. She had 90 seconds at most. The sergeant was at 69% oxygen saturation now, and his panic was making it worse, making him fight for air that wasn't coming. I need you to be still, she told him, and something in her voice made him stop struggling. Just still. 30 seconds and you can breathe again. She located the cricothyroid membrane with her fingers, the space between the cricoid and thyroid cartilage, the anatomical landmark they taught in first aid classes but almost nobody actually used outside of military trauma medicine. Her hands moved on their own now. The shears opened. The skin gave way with a thin sound, like paper tearing. A tiny spurt of blood. Not much. She didn't hesitate. The tube went in, a 5.0 endotracheal tube, smooth and precise. She felt its seat in the trachea, felt the give of the soft tissue accepting it. Tape it, she said, and someone was already moving with surgical tape. The bag valve mask came up, and oxygen started flowing through the tube she'd created. The monitor showed the oxygen saturation climbing immediately. 75%. 82%. 88%. The sergeant gasped, a real breath, a desperate grateful gasp of air finally reaching his lungs, and then his whole body went slack with the relief of not dying. Sinus rhythm. Steady. His eyes were wide, staring at her like she'd pulled him out of drowning water. Maybe she had. Get him to OR, Rachel said, already removing her gloves. Get someone on that tube. I'll write the handoff note. The room was quiet in that specific way that meant everyone had just watched something they didn't quite understand. Dr. Chen was looking at the tube, at the precise placement, at the absolutely textbook execution of a procedure that took most doctors weeks to learn and most nurses never learned at all. That's when Dr. Hargrove walked in. He filled the doorway the way certain men did, not because he was large, but because he'd spent years ensuring that people noticed when he entered a space. White coat immaculate. Gold watch on his left wrist, expensive enough that it caught the light. His eyes moved across the room, across the patient, across the scene, and then they landed on Rachel. They stayed there for just long enough that everyone noticed. His expression didn't change. That was the worst part. If he'd looked angry or confused, it would have been simple. Instead, he looked the way a man looks when he's found a problem that needs solving. When he spotted a variable he didn't know existed. Who performed this procedure? His voice was smooth. Reasonable. The voice of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. I did, Rachel said. She was already pulling off the second glove, folding it inside the first. Airway compromise, 90 seconds to SATs below 70. It was indicated. Dr. Hargrove stepped closer to the patient. He examined the tube placement with the kind of attention that was pure theater. He already knew it was perfect. That was exactly why he looked the way he did. Interesting, he said. Temp staff performing surgical airways. That's a policy question, I think. Dr. Chen, let's schedule a review of our crisis protocols. He turned away, already dismissing the scene. Already 3 moves ahead. Get this patient to OR. And someone clean up this bay. He left the same way he'd arrived, deliberately, letting everyone adjust to his absence like he'd taken something important with him. Rachel moved to the supply station and wrote the handoff note. Her handwriting was precise. The sergeant's name was Marcus Webb. 28 years old. Garrison soldier. He had a wife and a 4-month-old daughter waiting somewhere for him to come home. He would, now. Because of those 90 seconds. Because of hands that had practiced this procedure 8,000 times in places that didn't have hospitals. She was rinsing blood from her hands at the sink when she noticed Ellen watching her. That was incredible, Ellen said softly. How did you experience? Rachel said. She kept her voice level. She was already thinking about how to be invisible again. I've worked in trauma. It wasn't a lie. It was what people believed when you gave them something true but incomplete. She had worked in trauma. She'd worked in trauma under conditions that would have broken most people. She'd run combat medicine operations in Marjah under fire, kept soldiers alive in fields without power or supplies, trained medics in the kind of speed and precision that meant the difference between breathing and not breathing. But Oak Creek Memorial didn't need to know that. Rachel pushed through the doors toward the staff room. She had 20 minutes before her next rotation. She needed to check on the sergeant being wheeled to OR. She needed to fill out the incident report. She needed to be invisible again. That was the job. Not the emergency medicine. Not the life-saving. The job was being nobody. The job was being so ordinary that nobody asked questions about why a temp nurse could do things that attending physicians needed 3 years of fellowship to master. She was at her locker when she saw what was written on her name tag now. Someone had retrieved it from the trash. Someone had taped it back to her locker. But this time there was something new written underneath in the same permanent marker. Temp trash, it said. And underneath, we're watching. Rachel stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pulled it off again, dropped it in the trash, and walked back to the ER with her hand steady and her face blank. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you let someone see that something hurt, they'd hit that spot forever. The moment you showed them you were afraid, they'd find 1,000 ways to use it. She'd survived Marjah with her command intact, 18 months under fire, 2 Purple Hearts, a silver star that nobody would ever see. She could survive San Antonio. She could survive Dr. Hargrove's eyes watching her like she was a variable that needed controlling. She could survive whatever came next because she'd already survived the worst. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Hargrove had walked into that bay at exactly the wrong moment. The worst part was that he'd seen what she could do. The worst part was that now, watching her from across the hospital as she moved through the ER like water, he was beginning to understand that Rachel Torres was something far more complicated than a temp nurse pushing pills. And men like Dr. Hargrove never tolerated complicated. The staff meeting started at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, and Rachel Torres sat at the polished conference table with 11 other people, all of them waiting for Dr. Hargrove to finish his coffee. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look diseased. Rachel's hands rested flat on the table. Steady. She had learned long ago that visible tension was an invitation for predators. Dr. Hargrove set down his cup with deliberate precision. The ceramic made a soft click against the saucer, the kind of small sound that carried meaning in a room like this. He was a man constructed from old money and older arrogance, the kind of surgeon who believed his hands deserved worship and everyone else deserved doubt. His fingers were manicured. His cufflinks were gold. His smile, when he turned it toward Rachel, had the warmth of a shark's. Nurse Torres, he said, as if her name tasted like spoiled milk. Your case presentation on the web admission was adequate. Though I noticed you handled some supplies with unusual familiarity. Rachel didn't blink. I'm familiar with trauma protocols, Doctor. Fascinating. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. The residents around the table shifted. She could feel them watching, waiting to see if she would break. Tell me, then. The patient we admit with acute renal failure and on mechanical ventilation, what's the half-life of vecuronium in that scenario? The question was a trap dressed as an inquiry. Vecuronium was a paralyzing agent used during intubation, the kind of pharmacology that separated competent nurses from the ones who followed protocols without understanding them. Rachel had administered vecuronium in operating theaters under fire, had watched its effects while calculating survival margins in the dark. She knew the answer the way her hands knew how to tie surgical knots. 2.4 to 3.2 hours in normal renal function, she said, her voice level. Significantly prolonged in acute kidney injury. Approximately 5 to 7 hours. A flicker crossed Hargrove's face. He hadn't expected precision. He had expected hesitation, the kind that would let him extract her credentials with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. The residents relaxed slightly. One of them wrote something down. Hargrove's jaw tightened. And the interaction coefficient when concurrent magnesium sulfate administration occurs? The specifics, Nurse Torres. This was the escalation. This was the moment where he would stop asking and start performing. Rachel could see it in the way his fingers drummed against the table, the rhythm of a man accustomed to winning. The question was obscure enough that most nurses wouldn't have memorized the exact numbers. Most nurses didn't have 18 months of combat medicine burned into their muscle memory, didn't carry the weight of 73 lives saved in a province that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Magnesium potentiates neuromuscular blockade, Rachel said. Increases the duration of paralysis by approximately 30 to 50% depending on dosing. Most literature suggests reducing vecuronium dose by 20 to 30% when concurrent magnesium is being used for eclampsia or other indications. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone expected you to fail and you didn't. It was a dangerous silence. Hargrove's smile widened, but it became something else, less amused, more predatory. He glanced at the residents, then back to Rachel. Temp trash doesn't know pharmacology, he said, and the way he said it made it clear that competence was the actual threat. She knows Google. She knows how to appear credible for 5 minutes before the real doctors arrive. One of the residents made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. Rachel's jaw tightened, a single muscle tension that lasted less than a second. She had been called worse. She had been called worse in languages that most of these people would never understand. She had been called worse while holding a tourniquet on a young man's leg in a compound that was about to be overrun. This was noise. This was a man trying to diminish her because her hands worked better than his did, because she had answered his questions correctly, because she represented something he couldn't control. I'll review the literature, Rachel said quietly. Hargrove dismissed her with a wave, as if her agreement was beneath acknowledgement. He moved on to discuss hospital policy, but his eyes kept finding her across the table. She was a problem now. She was a problem because she was competent, because she was temporary, because she didn't have the institutional protection of a permanent contract or the social armor of his network of allies. She was vulnerable in exactly the way predators preferred. The meeting ended at 9:20. Rachel stood, gathered her notes, and moved toward the door with the same unhurried pace she had learned to cultivate, the kind of walk that suggested you belonged everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. One of the residents, a young man named Marcus with kind eyes, caught up with her in the hallway. That was impressive, he said. The pharmacology answer. Rachel didn't slow her pace. Thank you, Doctor. Where did you train? Before you came to Oak Creek. The question was innocent enough, but it contained landmines. Rachel had trained at the Naval Medical Institute. She had trained in operating theaters on military bases in 3 different countries. She had trained while people were dying around her, which was the kind of education that no civilian program could provide. She had trained to work in darkness with hands she couldn't see and equipment she had to improvise. Various places, she said. Nothing in my personnel file. The young resident blinked, understanding that he had wandered into territory that wasn't his to explore. He said nothing else, and Rachel continued to the ER, where the morning was building toward something she didn't yet know needed building. The end of her shift came at 4:30. Rachel was restocking a supply cart on the 3rd floor when her pager vibrated. Dr. Hargrove wanted her in the stairwell. Not a page. Not a formal request. A summoning, delivered like a threat. She took the cart to the supply room, noted the time on the handoff log, and walked toward the stairwell with the same composure she had maintained through the morning. The doors to the stairwell were heavier than normal doors. They closed with a pneumatic hiss that sealed the sound. Hargrove was waiting on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors. He was wearing his white coat, which meant he wanted to establish hierarchy, doctor and subordinate, authority and servant. The stairwell smelled like concrete and floor wax. The fluorescent lights in here were dimmer, more institutional, the kind that made everything look slightly wrong. "You think your little shortcuts impress people," he said, and he said it without preamble, as if they were continuing a conversation they had never started. "This isn't some field hospital in the middle of nowhere. This is Oak Creek Memorial. You're a temporary employee who needs to know her place." Rachel watched the wall behind him. The brick was painted an institutional green that had been popular in the 1970s. She could see a hairline crack running through the paint near the corner. She focused on that crack, the way she had learned to focus on nothing when confronted with people who believed that distance was something they could weaponize. Hargrove stepped closer. His cologne was overwhelming in the enclosed space, something expensive and aggressive, the kind of scent that announced itself like a declaration of war. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that most people would retreat. Rachel didn't retreat. Retreat was surrender. Retreat was the exact thing he wanted, because it would validate his assumption that she was smaller than him, quieter than him, less important. "You understand what I'm saying?" he asked. "Yes, Doctor," Rachel said. Her voice was flat, professional, the kind of voice you used when you were translating rather than speaking. "I understand my position." "Do you?" He raised his hand as if he might touch her, then seemed to reconsider. The gesture hung in the air between them, a threat that didn't quite complete itself. "Because from where I'm standing, you seem to have forgotten that you're here by permission. You don't have a permanent contract. You don't have colleagues protecting you. You don't have anything except what I decide to give you or take away." Rachel's hands remained at her sides. Her breathing remained steady. She had been threatened by men with actual weapons, actual authority, actual capability to make consequences real. This was a man with a hospital ID badge and a network of country club acquaintances. "Understood, Doctor," she said. Hargrove held the moment for a few seconds longer, watching for a crack, a tremor, a tear, a sign that his words had penetrated the way words were supposed to penetrate. Rachel's face remained composed, her eyes neither challenging nor submissive. She was a blank slate, which was far more infuriating to him than any confrontation would have been. He stepped back, his hand dropping. "Don't let me catch you overstepping again." She waited until he had walked up the stairs before moving. Then she descended, each step deliberate and even, her hand trailing along the metal railing. By the time she reached the ground floor, her heart rate had returned to normal. By the time she clocked out, she had filed away the encounter in the same compartment where she filed away everything that didn't require immediate response. The next morning came dark and cold, arriving before dawn the way San Antonio mornings did in February. Rachel was at her locker by 6:30, pulling out her scrubs for her shift. The name tag was sitting on the top shelf. Someone had taken the previous one, the one that said Rachel Torres, RN, and written temp trash across it in black permanent marker. The handwriting was aggressive, slashing. The letters overlapped each other like they were fighting for space. Rachel stared at it for approximately 4 seconds. She didn't feel anything, that was the strange part. She didn't feel anger or humiliation or the hot bloom of shame that such things were supposed to produce. She felt instead the peculiar clarity that came from watching someone else's life from a great distance, as if she were a camera documenting events rather than the person experiencing them. She reached out, peeled the name tag away from the magnetic backing, and dropped it into the trash can beside the lockers. It landed on top of a discarded coffee cup. She clipped a new name tag onto her scrubs, blank except for her name and the hospital logo. Then she walked toward the ER, where rounds were beginning. But that wasn't the worst part. Not the worst part at all. By 7 o'clock, when Rachel was checking patients, Hargrove was in his office with the door closed, making phone calls. The first was to Robert Chen, a hospital board member who owed Hargrove money from a failed real estate investment and therefore owed him favors. Hargrove's voice was smooth, careful, the voice of a man who understood leverage. "Robert, I need you to do something for me regarding a personnel matter," Hargrove said. "There's a temporary nurse in my department. Rachel Torres. I need you to pull her file from HR and tell me if there are any red flags. Look for inconsistencies in her background. Military service claims that don't add up. Anything that suggests she's overstating her credentials." Chen asked what this was about. "She performed a procedure this morning that's outside her scope. I'm concerned about liability. Hospital protection, you understand. Before I escalate formally, I wanted to make sure the board understood the risk." The second call was to Dr. Marcus Wellington, a former colleague from Hargrove's residency who now worked at a competing hospital in Austin. Wellington had left San Antonio after Hargrove had made his life professionally difficult. He would remember that. He would understand the implicit offer to return the favor. "Marcus, it's James Hargrove. I need you to call someone for me. A nurse who trained wherever you trained. Rachel Torres. I need a character reference, or lack thereof. She's working here now, and I'm not convinced her credentials are legitimate. I'm starting to wonder if she's been misrepresenting her background." Wellington hesitated. "That's pretty serious." "It is," Hargrove agreed. "Which is why I'm asking someone I trust to verify." Quietly. The third call was to the hospital's credentialing department, where Hargrove suggested, not demanded, which would have been too obvious, that Rachel's temporary contract should perhaps require more thorough vetting before her employment was extended. Temporary staff sometimes slipped through the cracks, he mentioned. Sometimes people inflated their experience to get through hiring. By the time Rachel finished her shift at 2 o'clock, the machinery had begun turning. Not loudly. Not obviously. But with the inexorable pressure of institutional systems designed to protect their own. Hargrove had weapons that nothing in her past had prepared her for, not bullets, not explosives, not the straightforward violence of combat. Institutional weapons. Credentialing systems. Board connections. The kind of machinery that destroyed people quietly, in conference rooms and email chains, where evidence was deniable and consequences were permanent. He was good at this. That was the thing. He was genuinely competent at institutional warfare, which made him far more dangerous than he would have been if he were simply a bully. A bully could be confronted. A man who understood how to weaponize an entire hospital's infrastructure was something else entirely. And Rachel Torres, who had survived things that would have broken most people, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest threats don't arrive with weapons at all. The paramedics burst through the emergency room doors at 2:17 p.m. Thursday like men who had already lost the battle. The stretcher hit the tile with a metallic crash. Sergeant Marcus Webb lay sprawled across it, his neck tilted at an angle that made the residents freeze, his airway collapsing in real time, blood filling his throat in the patient's own rhythm, a training accident, combat rappel gone wrong, a fall from 32 feet that had crushed his larynx into itself. The lead paramedic was shouting vitals. "Severe airway compromise, unable to intubate, we've tried twice, blood everywhere, he's desaturating, O2 sat dropping." The words came fast and desperate. The attending physician on duty was Dr. Morrison, a careful man who specialized in caution, and his face had already gone the color of institutional surrender. The residents scattered like schools of fish sensing the shark, their protocols and training evaporating in the face of a crisis that lived in the space between seconds. Rachel was on the other side of the floor, finishing medication rounds on the orthopedic wing. She heard the code announcement crackle through the overhead intercom, the particular tone of voice that meant not a drill, not routine, meant something was actively dying in Trauma Bay 4. She moved. Not fast. Not slowly. Just moved, like water finding the path downhill without thinking about it, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought could raise its hand with objections. The bay was chaos with a scientific name. Dr. Morrison had a laryngoscope in his hand, the blade already positioned, trying again to thread an endotracheal tube past the swelling that was eating Sergeant Webb's airway from the inside. Nothing. The tube wouldn't go. Blood pooled in the back of the throat faster than suction could clear it. The O2 sat was dropping like an elevator with a severed cable, 88, 82, 76, falling, and no one in that room needed anyone else to tell them that when it hit 40, the brain starts dying. When it hit 20, everything stops. Rachel stood at the bay entrance. Gloved. Masked. Present. She took the scene in whole, not piece by piece but as a single integrated system. Webb's skin mottled. The angle of his jaw. The resistance Morrison was meeting. The way the blood kept coming because the airway trauma was active and the body was trying to breathe through something that wasn't open anymore. Dr. Morrison glanced up and made eye contact with her for exactly 1 second. It was a look that said, if you have anything, now is the moment. Rachel moved into the bay. She didn't ask permission. Permission is for people who have alternatives. Cricothyrotomy, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was just present, like a compass needle pointing north. We don't have time for another intubation attempt. Morrison hesitated for the length of a single heartbeat. That hesitation was the space where protocols lived, where the chain of command existed, where a temporary nurse was supposed to stand in the corner and let the attending make decisions. The monitor beeped. O2 sat, 71. Still falling. Still dying. Morrison stepped back. Do it. Rachel had the trauma shears out of her pocket before he finished speaking. The ones with the callsign engraved on the handle, the ones she carried even though carrying them was the definition of risk, the ones that had been with her through 3 tours and 2 continents and an entire life that had been legally erased. She located the cricothyroid membrane by touch, that soft space between the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage, the one anatomical landmark that never moved, that was always in the same place on every human throat. She didn't think about it. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of time. The shears went in. 1 cut, clean, no hesitation. The sound was small, just a soft shearing of metal through tissue, but the effect was immediate. She inserted a 4.0 endotracheal tube, and suddenly, there was an open airway. Suddenly, the ventilator could do its job. Suddenly, Sergeant Marcus Webb could breathe. The monitor stabilized. The O2 sat climbed like something alive coming back from the edge. 76, 84. 91, 96. Sinus rhythm held steady. The blood stopped its accumulation. The color began to return to the edges of his skin like someone waking from a dream. 12 seconds had elapsed. Maybe 14. The entire crisis, the entire rescue, had taken the length of time it takes to tie a shoelace. Rachel stepped back. She set the shears on the instrument tray. She peeled off the gloves, dropped them in the biohazard container, and walked back out of Trauma Bay 4 with her hand steady and her face arranged in the particular expression of someone who had just done her job and was now ready to return to doing her job. Behind her, Dr. Morrison was staring at the airway she had created, and the look in his eyes was something between awe and profound realization. The residents were perfectly still. The kind of still that meant they had just witnessed something that lived outside their training manuals. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Hargrove was walking through the ER corridor exactly 43 minutes later when he heard what had happened. He heard it from Dr. Morrison, who felt obligated to report the procedure. He heard it from the residents, whose whispers traveled through the hospital like smoke through an open window. He heard it in the particular way that colleagues stopped talking when he entered the break room, the way they glanced at each other and then looked away. He understood, in that moment, that something had shifted in the delicate architecture of his authority. A temporary nurse, a woman he had spent the last 3 days public humiliating, a woman he had marginalized and dismissed and driven to the edges of the institution, had just performed a procedure that required knowledge he didn't possess, precision he couldn't match, and a level of calm under pressure that made him look like what he actually was, a careful man playing the role of a competent surgeon. Hargrove picked up his phone at 2:51 p.m. He called Robert Chen, a board member who had been his medical school classmate and who owed him favors from years of surgical consultations and strategic silence about various professional missteps. "We have a situation," Hargrove said. His voice was level. That was always how he sounded when he was most dangerous. A temp nurse performed unsupervised surgical procedures this afternoon. Cricothyrotomy on a critical patient. No attending present at the moment of intervention. Significant scope of practice violation. I need an emergency review. Chen listened. Chen understood what Hargrove did not say, which was that this temp nurse had made Hargrove look powerless, made him look replaceable, made him look like the obstacle instead of the authority. "I'll get the investigator," Chen said. "Patricia Winters. She's thorough." Hargrove hung up and made the second call. Patricia Winters answered on the second ring. She was a hospital investigator who specialized in credential reviews, the kind of woman who could make a file grow teeth if she wanted it to. Hargrove had hired her twice before to investigate staff members he wanted gone. She knew how the game was played. "I need you to pull a complete personnel file," he said. "Temporary nurse, Rachel Torres, working in multiple departments. Document everything. Missing certifications, gaps in credentials, unauthorized procedure this afternoon, emergency cricothyrotomy performed without attending present. I need a comprehensive scope of practice violation report by tomorrow morning." Winters didn't ask questions. Questions were for people who didn't already understand. The third call was more delicate. Dr. Susan Mallory at the Texas Medical Board. Hargrove kept his voice casual, collegial, the tone of one professional consulting another. "Just a personal inquiry," he said. "Off the record. Can you check the licensing status of Rachel Torres, RN, supposed to be working as temporary staff here at Oak Creek Memorial? I'm concerned about the authenticity of her credentials." By 3:15 p.m., Hargrove had set the machinery in motion. He had printed out hospital protocols, 17 pages highlighting the specific sections about attending supervision, scope of practice, procedural authorization. He had called intimidated residents into his office and suggested, very gently, that they should document their concerns about his unauthorized colleague. One of them, a third-year resident named James Park who was afraid of Hargrove and everything he represented, had written a statement, "I observed the temporary nurse perform a cricothyrotomy without clear authorization from the attending physician. I have concerns about patient safety and procedural protocol compliance." It was a lie wrapped in institutional language. Hargrove had framed it for the personnel file. By 4:30 p.m., he was composing the termination letter. The language was perfect, regretful, professional, citing safety concerns and protocol violations. He signed it an hour early, before the administrative meeting even happened, because he already knew how it would go. The machinery doesn't reverse once it starts turning. Rachel received the meeting notice at 6:45 p.m. It came through her personal phone as a text message from James Kwan, the Human Resources Director. "Please report to Administrative Conference Room B at 7:30 p.m. for disciplinary review meeting. This is mandatory. Bring all credentials and certifications." She read it twice. She sat in an empty patient room, room for 12, which had been discharged that morning and was waiting for the cleaning crew, and she stared at the message the way someone might stare at a letter that had been opened by the wrong hands. She understood what was happening. She had seen this pattern before, in different uniforms and different contexts, but the pattern was always the same: institutional power consolidating against perceived threat. The difference was that in Marjah, she had weapons. Here, at Oak Creek Memorial in San Antonio, she had nothing but silence and training and the knowledge that Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres officially did not exist. She could not defend herself by speaking the truth about who she was. The moment she did, the military would activate protocols that had been waiting 18 years for her to break cover. Prosecution. Loss of benefits. Exposure of operations that were still classified, still defended by people in very high positions. She had been ordered to disappear. The disappearing part was the only order she had ever broken, that is, she had appeared, she had become a nurse, she had tried to have a life. But the moment she surfaced as who she really was, everything that she had built would collapse. She stood up. She walked to her locker. She removed her trauma shears from the bottom, the ones with her call sign engraved on the handle, the ones that had just saved a man's life in 90 seconds. She placed them in her bag. She clocked out at 7:13 p.m. She walked toward Administrative Conference Room B with her head up and her hand steady and absolutely no idea that everything was about to change. The conference room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like industrial coffee and the particular staleness that accumulates when people gather to make decisions that will break other people. Rachel sat across from Dr. Hargrove, James Kwon, and Linda Hoffman at 7:32 p.m. Thursday evening. The fluorescent panels above cast everything in a light that made skin look the color of old pennies. Hargrove had documents spread across the laminate table like evidence at a crime scene, which, Rachel understood, was exactly what he intended. Nurse Torres performed a cricothyrotomy without attending supervision, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular precision of someone who had rehearsed these words. That violates hospital protocol for .7.2 and exceeds her scope of practice as a temporary employee. He gestured toward a clear evidence bag containing her trauma shears, the ones with the call sign engraved on the handle, the ones that had been her invisible companion for 6 years. She used personal equipment of unknown sterility and provenance. The patient survived despite her recklessness, not because of it. Rachel sat with her hands flat on the table. She did not move her jaw. She did not clench her fists. She had been trained by people who understood that composure was a weapon and that giving Hargrove the satisfaction of visible distress would be the same as handing him a loaded gun. The critical issue, Kwon said carefully, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, is scope of practice. Ms. Torres, where did you learn to perform advanced trauma procedures? Rachel met his eyes. Previous employment. Which employment? Hoffman leaned forward, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. I'm not at liberty to discuss it. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a door closes on information nobody is allowed to open. Hargrove smiled, a thin expression that looked like something a predator might show before it struck. Her file has employment gaps totaling 6 years. No explanation. No references we can contact. She performed a procedure that could have killed the patient, and when questioned about her qualifications, she claims classified work she can't document. He turned to Kwon and Hoffman with the expression of a man who had already won. I move for immediate termination, effective immediately. For cause. Rachel could have defended herself. She could have explained that she had performed emergency cricothyrotomies 47 times under sustained fire in Marjah. She could have told them that her hands had held together soldiers who were supposed to die, that she had done field surgery in compounds where the sound of mortars was the rhythm section underneath everything else, that the procedure she had performed on Sergeant Webb had been executed with the kind of muscle memory that only came from doing it until it became as natural as breathing. She could have told them all of that. Instead, she said nothing. Because the military, her military, the one that had trained her and sent her into the dark and then erased her from every official record, had given her explicit orders 6 years ago: you disappear, you keep your mouth shut, you never surface, or you risk prosecution under the Espionage Act. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Ms. Torres. Kwon waited. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Rachel looked at each of them in turn. Kwon, who was trying to be fair. Hoffman, who was uncomfortable but would vote however Hargrove needed her to vote. And Hargrove himself, whose entire face had the satisfied expression of a man watching a house he had set on fire finally collapse. "No," Rachel said quietly. At 8:03 p.m., they voted. 2-1. Quan abstained. At 8:20 p.m., hospital security escorted her from the building. They didn't touch her arm or make it theatrical. They simply walked beside her toward the main entrance, and Rachel moved through the hallways of Oak Creek Memorial for what turned out to be the last time, her head level, her breathing even, her face showing nothing of the particular kind of dissolution that was happening underneath. The parking lot was empty except for scattered cars under lights that hummed their monotonous yellow song. Rachel drove for 2 hours on I-10, passing towns that were dark and identical, until the interstate seemed to go on forever. She exited at a random off-ramp around midnight and found herself in a place called Lakeside, which had maybe 4 streetlights and a single diner that was open. At 3 a.m., Rachel sat in a booth at Mel's Diner, staring at her reflection in the dark window beside her table. The coffee in front of her had turned cold and developed that pale film that coffee gets when it's been sitting untouched for too long. Outside, the night was the kind of quiet that felt like wait. The highway was a distant hum. A handful of big rigs sat in the parking lot like sleeping animals. She thought about disappearing. Actually disappearing this time. Not the kind of disappearing she had done 6 years ago, the official kind, where you kept your head down and lived in neutral colors and took jobs that asked nothing about your past. The real kind. New city. New name. The 4th reinvention in 6 years. She could do it. She had done it before. She had the skills, the discipline, the absolute absence of attachments that made it possible. The waitress, a woman somewhere between 50 and 70 with dyed black hair and tired eyes, refilled Rachel's coffee without speaking. She had learned, probably from decades of serving people in the dark hours, that sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. Rachel's reflection stared back at her from the black window, pale from too many overnight shifts, hair pulled back in a way that made her face look angular and stripped of anything soft. She didn't recognize herself. Some part of her wondered if anyone ever would again. What she didn't know, in that moment in the diner with her cold coffee and her reflection and her thoughts about disappearing, was that the machinery of something much larger than Oak Creek Memorial had already begun moving. Patricia Winters, the investigator that Hargrove had hired, had decided to dig deeper into Rachel's background than Hargrove had anticipated. At 11:47 p.m. Thursday night, she had entered Rachel Torres into a federal database query. At 1:15 a.m. Friday morning, that query triggered a Department of Defense security flag. The flag escalated. It reached someone's desk at Fort Meade. At 2:30 a.m., encrypted calls had begun waking people, a captain in San Antonio, a Navy chaplain at Naval Station Coronado, an admiral whose name was classified but whose authority was absolute. At 3:42 a.m., Rachel's phone rang. She stared at it for 3 seconds. Unknown number. No caller ID. At 3 in the morning, in a diner called Mel's in a town called Lakeside, an unknown number could mean anything. It could mean nothing. It could mean the kind of call that changes the trajectory of everything that comes after. Rachel answered. Lieutenant Commander Torres. The voice was male, mid-register, speaking with the precision of someone trained to communicate across distance and static. This is Captain James Mitchell, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. We need you to come to Oak Creek Memorial. There's a situation we need to discuss regarding Sergeant Marcus Webb and your employment termination. A vehicle will pick you up at your current location in 20 minutes. You're not in trouble. But we need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what we say. The call ended. Rachel set the phone down on the vinyl booth seat. She looked at her cold coffee. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She looked at the waitress, who was pretending not to have heard the phone call but whose expression had shifted, not drastically, just enough that Rachel understood she had caught the tail end of the word Lieutenant Commander. Rachel set cash on the table. She stood. She walked out of Mel's Diner and stood in the parking lot under the massive San Antonio sky, waiting for headlights to emerge from the darkness. The air smelled like diesel and heated asphalt and the particular emptiness of places where nothing was supposed to happen. The thing nobody tells you about having a secret that big is that the moment it starts to come out, there's no stopping it. It moves like something alive. It moves like something that's been waiting in the dark, and finally, someone has opened the door. The federal flag triggered at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, buried in layers of classified databases that civilians never knew existed. Patricia Winters, the investigator Dr. Hargrove had hired to destroy Rachel Torres, had dug too deep. She'd cross-referenced a 14-digit service number against Department of Defense personnel files, and the moment her cursor landed on that sequence, every alarm in the system lit up simultaneously. The classified servers didn't scream. They didn't alert anyone. They simply locked her out and sent a silent notification to a secure facility in Arlington, Virginia, where a 2-star admiral was already drinking her 3rd cup of coffee at an hour when most of San Antonio was still asleep. By 6:15 a.m., military intelligence officers were landing at Lackland Air Force Base. By 7:30 a.m., they were walking through the executive corridor of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital with credentials that made the board chairman's face go pale. No warrant. No questions. Just quiet authority that moved like water through the building, unstoppable, inevitable, and completely silent. The officers didn't arrest anyone. They didn't raise their voices. They simply sat across from Hospital Administrator Richard Chen and the board's legal counsel and explained, very calmly, that Oak Creek Memorial had just terminated the employment of Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, USN, holder of a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars, whose classified military service file they had just accessed. The admiral on the secure line, speaking through a speakerphone that sounded like it was broadcasting from inside a vault, outlined exactly what that meant: federal wrongful termination lawsuit, loss of federal Medicare reimbursement contracts worth $47 million annually, and a Department of Defense audit of every procurement decision the hospital had made in the past 5 years. Dr. Hargrove's investigation had opened a door he couldn't close. Patricia Winters' deep dive into Rachel's background had triggered the federal flag, yes, but it had also exposed something else. Something worse. When the military intelligence team requested access to the hospital's digital systems, they found Hargrove's fingerprints all over the compromised files. Falsified surgical logs dating back for years. 7 instances where he'd attributed his own mistakes to subordinates, documented perfectly in his own handwriting across the hospital's credentialing system. Financial records showing kickbacks from MedSupply Corp., $340,000 in exchange for exclusive contracts that inflated patient costs by 22%. Performance reviews he'd fabricated against 7 other staff members who had challenged him. One of those staff members was a trauma surgeon who left medicine entirely after Hargrove's manufactured complaints torpedoed her reputation. Her name was Dr. Sarah Mendez, and she was now a public defender in Corpus Christi, working for $30,000 a year because the man sitting in the hospital's executive suite had decided she didn't know her place. The admiral made a phone call at 8 a.m. By 8:47 a.m., the Texas Medical Board had opened a formal investigation into Dr. Hargrove's practice. By noon, 3 former surgical nurses had come forward with documented complaints they'd been threatened into withdrawing. A patient's family produced evidence, medical records, emails, hospital transcripts, showing that their mother had died from a surgical error Hargrove made during a routine cholecystectomy, which he had blamed on a resident in training. That resident was now working at a clinic in Austin, his confidence shattered, his credentials questioned, his name whispered in circles where everyone knew the truth but no one spoke it. Saturday morning. The hospital's board met in emergency session while security watched the parking lot and federal investigators occupied the 2nd floor. They offered Dr. Hargrove a choice at 2 p.m., delivered by his attorney in a room where he couldn't refuse: resign immediately with a quiet settlement to avoid criminal prosecution, or face a very public trial for fraud, malpractice, and witness intimidation that would be broadcast across medical boards in 3 states. His attorney had already negotiated the terms. No jail time in exchange for full financial restitution, a signed admission of wrongdoing, and a gag order that prevented him from discussing the hospital or his medical career publicly. His medical license would be permanently revoked pending a formality hearing that everyone knew would confirm it. He signed at 3 p.m. By Monday morning, Dr. Hargrove was clearing out his office while security watched from the doorway, arms crossed, faces blank. Residents lined the hallway in silence. Nurses stood in the break room, watching through the window. Nobody spoke. Nobody helped him carry boxes. Nobody said goodbye. The man who had wielded institutional power like a weapon, who had used hospital policy as a knife and hierarchy as a shield, walked toward the exit alone, his hands carrying the weight of 4 years of cruelty that had finally caught up with him. He was escorted from the building by 9:30 a.m. His parking pass was deactivated. His security badge was collected. His name was removed from the directory. By noon, his office had been reassigned to a new attending physician, and his name had been scrubbed from the hospital's website so thoroughly that it was as if he had never existed there at all. The board offered Rachel full reinstatement with back pay, 6 weeks of wages, calculated down to the penny, a formal written apology, and something more. They offered her the chance to direct a new veterans trauma program, an initiative they wanted to launch in spring. It was an attempt to repair what they had allowed. Rachel negotiated. She didn't ask for much. Full autonomy over hiring and curriculum. A dedicated trauma bay assigned exclusively to the program. And a scholarship fund for military medics transitioning to civilian medicine, because she had seen what happened to people like her, trained to operate at the highest level, then discarded the moment they stopped being useful. The board agreed to everything. By Friday morning, Rachel Torres had already hired for former special operations medics. By the following Monday, she had redesigned the entire trauma intake protocol to account for blast injuries, penetrating trauma, and the specific cascade of injuries that came from environments most civilian hospitals never saw. The trauma shears with her callsign engraved on the handle, the ones that had saved Sergeant Marcus Webb's life, were placed in a glass display case outside the emergency department, mounted on navy blue velvet with a brass plaque that read, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, USN. In recognition of service above and beyond. The glass was mounted in the wall where every doctor, every nurse, every resident, and every visitor would see it every single day. The case was unveiled on a Friday afternoon in front of staff and administration. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. The silence was the sound of institutional acknowledgement, the sound of a hospital understanding that it had nearly destroyed someone it couldn't afford to lose. Across San Antonio, in a modest home office that smelled like leather and regret, Dr. Hargrove sat staring at his revoked medical license. The document had arrived by courier at 4 p.m., printed on heavy stock, bearing the official seal of the Texas Medical Board. His phone rang continuously. Colleagues stopped calling after the first few days. His ex-wife called to tell him she was keeping the house. His attorney called with tax implications. By evening, the silence was absolute. He had accepted a position at Westside Animal Clinic, scheduling appointments for dogs and cats, wearing scrubs without his name embroidered, earning $16 an hour. When clients asked if he was new, he nodded and didn't elaborate. His hands, which had once performed surgery, which had held power through precision, now filed paperwork and answered phones. The transformation was complete. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through Oak Creek Memorial in navy blue scrubs, the words Director, Veterans Trauma Program embroidered across her chest. Staff nodded as she passed, respectful but not obsequious. The timidity was gone. The careful invisibility had been replaced with something else, the quiet authority of someone who had already survived the worst and still chose to show up. She ran morning rounds with her 4 hired medics, teaching them how to translate the medicine of Marjah, of Kandahar, of Helmand Province into the language that San Antonio's trauma bays understood. Sergeant Marcus Webb returned for a follow-up appointment in the 4th month, walking on his own, his airway healed, his voice whole. His father, a 3-star general, was with him, gripping Rachel's hand in the lobby with the kind of intensity that only comes from someone who understands exactly what had been done and exactly who had done it. In the new Veterans Trauma Wing, photographs lined the walls, Marines, sailors, soldiers, medics. One photo showed her unit in Marjah, the faces of people she couldn't save and the 73 she could. A young veteran applying for the program stood in front of it, reading the names, his jaw tight, his shoulders carrying the weight of things he'd never learned how to put down. He asked nervously, "Do I belong here?" Rachel showed him the scars on her forearm, visible now that she didn't hide them. The marks of shrapnel, of surgical steel, of 18 months under fire. "You belong exactly here," she said. "Everyone who walks through that door belongs exactly here." That evening, Rachel sat in her office as sunset painted San Antonio gold and rust. A nurse knocked on the doorframe, "Incoming trauma, car accident, patient critical, ETA for minutes." Rachel grabbed her trauma kit and her composure, the latter so practiced now that it felt like breathing. She ran toward the ER the way she'd run toward every crisis that had defined her life, completely present, completely steady, and absolutely certain that the person in front of her would survive. The trauma shears gleamed in their display case as she passed, catching the emergency lights like a beacon. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and institutional reckoning. Like this video if you believe the quietest people often carry the heaviest load. Comment: have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? Because I want to hear your story. We'll see you in the next one.